This workshop is essentially a product, it's a deliverable of a large AI product that's led by the University of California, Riverside. And although AI is not ready for prime time yet, in the process we've been generating data streams that have impacts that allow for management decisions. So this seminar will outline some AI, but it'll share a whole lot of other data streams that are being generated that can be used today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Orestes Morfin. I'm a hydrologist with the Central Arizona Project, and I work for a group that concentrates uniquely on the Colorado River. We don't really do anything within the service area, so I'm with the Colorado River programs. So my focus is on hydrology, snowpack, supply. I do a fair amount of the modeling that informs our operations division on how much we may or may not expect to be able to divert in a particular year, or also I explore things like conservation scenarios, things people may or may not be able to do to buffer our supply. And what I'm going to show you today, Charles asked me to come here and talk about current conditions on the river, and I just, rather than having a canned presentation, I thought it would be a good idea to walk folks through a new tool that we just developed not a few weeks ago. And what this tool does is it basically, you can get to this link on the CAP website, the publicly available CAP website, and it's called the Colorado River Conditions Dashboard. So basically what the components of this dashboard are you may or may not be familiar with our monthly board meetings. They're open to the public, and they're simulcast online. So and we have these on the first Thursday of every month, and anybody can attend. And what my group does as part of the show is that we get up and we present current conditions on the Colorado River. So as an outgrowth of of that, we started getting a lot of questions, with the drought situation over the past 23 years. We started getting a lot of questions, particularly in recent years, as the reservoirs have dropped. Could we maybe get more frequent updates of this information? Could we maybe make this information more readily available to folks? So we came up with this idea, and the material that's on this dashboard is essentially an outgrowth of what we would present anyway to the board. Now, we present this to the board once a month, but on the dashboard, what we will be doing is updating this every 2 weeks. So the public can go in here and check out the status of the system, see what's happening on the river, and I'm just going to walk you through a couple of the components. So what we typically lead off with in our presentations to our board is the system contents. Here you can see this map up here on the left that I just highlighted accidentally. And what that is it's a very sort of quick and dirty teacup diagram representation of the major reservoirs in the upper and lower basin. Most of them are in the upper basin. You can see Lake Powell, and then the Aspinall units and the upper basin reservoirs on the right up in Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, and then Lake Mead on the left. We typically represent these in terms of percentage of capacity. So when you see these percent numbers up there, that's not a percentage of any historical average or anything. That's a straight percentage of how full is the reservoir. For Lake Powell and Lake Mead, we go into a bit more detail, and we give percent capacity. We give the actual numbers of how many millions of acre feet are in the reservoirs, the current elevation, and we call out in red. You'll see the elevation of the lake with respect to certain tiers, shortage tiers, certain regulatory levels that will mandate changes in behavior. So that's sort of a quick, the first thing we typically lead off with. And this reservoir capacities table that you see on the left is something that we used to embed in that figure. We no longer do that. We were calling this out here because what this does is show you how the reservoirs have changed with respect to the previous month. Okay, so this is still, we'll do this every 2 weeks, but this is still with respect to the previous month. You'll see the current, the amount of water in the reservoir that changed with respect to the previous month, and then the maximum there is just the capacity of the reservoir. So you can sort of tell by how these numbers change where you are in the runoff season or in the irrigation season. Right now, you can see that meat has dropped a little bit with respect to previous month. You can see that Lake Powell's gained a little. So. Navajo and Blue Mesa have also gained, but for the most part, you can see that the upper basin reservoirs, if they're not really gaining a small amount, they're kind of static. And what that tells us is that melt hasn't really started yet. So we've got a lot of snowpack in the upper basin. We've got anywhere from between 142 to 150% of the median over the last 30 years. So we've got a decent snowpack in our headwaters, right? Because we watch the headwaters of the Colorado and the Green in Wyoming. So we're always conscious of that, but this tells us that meltwater hasn't started showing up in the system. So it's not quite the runoff system that typically begins. The runoff typically begins in about April. I mean, it can be as early as March, but we like to typically watch what happens between April and July. So that's available for people. And of course, so all of the headwater areas, like up here in the Green, up here where you see Fontenelle Reservoir, over here in the upper Colorado, in the upper basin where you see Crystal and Blue Mesa, those are really important areas for us because those constitute about 70% of the snow that's going to feed the system in a given year. And what we like to do is watch what's called the SWE, so the snow water equivalent. And snow water equivalent is just, if you took the snowpack and melted it down, how much water would you get out of it? How many inches of water would you get out of that? And this is tracked very delicately by the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. And what they do is they generate these snow accumulation, these SWE figures. And this is sort of what they look like. And this is a graph of the snow water equivalent for the current year. Now what you're looking at here is 2023 is that blue line that's jacking way up above the crest there. Previous year is 2022, which is the green. And then the 30-year average of 1991 to 2020 is that purple line. So you could see, and they update this all the time. They update this almost daily. You could see that we are having a very good year in the snow equivalent arena. And that means good news for us. Now this is just 1 year. A lot of people will ask me, oh, the drought's over, right? Because we've had a good year. Well, no, it's going to take several years like this to beef up storage in a reservoir. This gets you out of the woods for the short term. But what we really need is several years of this to increase storage in the reservoirs. And the reservoirs are at 23, 25% of capacity. It's going to take a lot of years like this to bump up that storage to a place where we really feel confident that it will provide some long-term stability. So that's good news. and what we don't have on here yet, and we're debating whether or not to put on, is the pre-existing conditions. So this snow falls on high altitude terrain. It helps if that high altitude terrain is already kind of wet. If you've had a wet fall leading up to that winter, right? Because then the soil's pretty flush with moisture, and the problem with the snow falling on very dry soil is that that soil then needs to take has a deficit, right? It's dry, and when melt starts, it will absorb a lot of that melt. So in a dry fall, in a year with a dry fall, we will not typically, we won't get as much as we might expect from a really good snowpack. And we've had several dry falls the past 10, 23 years, and that's sort of what's contributed to this issue. But this is a good year, and we're hoping that even though it was a slow start, we're hoping that we can get a couple of extra years of security out of this. So after SWE, we look at the unregulated runoff inflow into Lake Powell. And what you're seeing here is in millions of acre feet, since Powell's been filling, what are the years, what have we gotten in these years? And you could see we sort of peaked in the 2000s, early 2000, and have been on a kind of a steady downward trend since then. And these numbers are published by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. And we graph them up every year, and we see sort of where the trend is headed. And these are averages. The dotted lines are averages, and you can see the historical average over the whole historical records. That black line is kind of high. But as we focus in on more recent time periods, you can see that average starts to drop. And then what part of this analysis is it involves looking at the most probable hydrology, the maximum probable hydrology, and the minimum probable hydrology. So it's kind of a dice game. The blue lines are what's really actually happened, okay? And then the three colored lines on the end are the min, most, and max probable. So, those are what we think could happen. And the blue is what's actually happened. So we watch that very closely, because that kind of tells you how much water you're going to get out of your snowpack. So finally, we come down to, condensing into a table form a little bit about how much water Arizona has contributed to the lake, to Lake Mead over the past couple of years in terms of conservation and contributions. And basically, we break it down into voluntary contributions, DCP contributions made by the state, reclamation DCP, and these are the various types of the list on the left there going down that table are the various types of intentionally created surplus, ICS, various types of conservation program results that we promote and support, and with the volumes of water in there, and you could see that we've saved quite a considerable amount of water, of quite a few million acre feet over the past several years. And this is all as a part of, like I say, our support for the DCP, the Drought Contingency Plan, and then our annual conservation efforts from, I think it's from 07, is it? From 08 to the present. Now, as I say, this information is, this is a new tool. It's, it's going to be updated every 2 weeks. And so, it's readily available on the CAP website, and I guess that's my main objective today is to just, let people know that this is available, and it's easy to access. And if you have any questions, certainly right now, I'd be happy to take them. But also, you can also always write to any of us in the Colorado River Programs group at CAP on email. Are there any questions here for so far what I've presented?
Would you be able to log in and show us the steps to get to this site? Or?
Yeah, sure. Actually, you don't even need to log in. It's all from the CAP website. So this drops you, this is if you go to cap/as.com, it's a dash, thank you. Yeah, so if you go to capaz.com, it's right here. Your new Colorado River Conditions Dashboard. It's on the front page. Read more, bang. And there you go. Drops you into it.
Even I can do that.
Yeah, if I could do it, you could do it.
So what's the difference between regulated and unregulated?
So the regulated inflow is, it has to do with removing the flows from operations upstream of Powell, and seeing what would be coming into the reservoir, if those weren't up, if there were no diversions upstream from it. So it's a difference of basically anthropogenic influence versus free water. Yeah.
Any other questions for Orestes?
What do you see from the demand going forward on the system, like 20 years from now?
Ooh, that's a great question. I can't speak to what's gonna any sort of specific numbers, but I know all I can tell you is that we work very closely with our counterparts in California and Nevada and Colorado and Utah and the other basin states and Mexico to try and keep demand down. Arizona's been pretty good. I mean, we use less water now than we did in the 80s. And we have seen a substantial growth in population, an exponential growth in population.
But you're using less water, I think, because you're covering up agricultural land. If you run out of agricultural land to cover up, where are you going to get the supply from?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is an excellent question. We are, part of what I'm focused on in my group is looking at diversification and augmentation. So two things. So with diversification, all that means is, we're looking at potentially new sources of water from other places. So for example, brackish groundwater desal, water reuse and recycling, or groundwater, wheeling groundwater through the canal. These are when I think of diversification, I think of finding water in other places. When I think of augmentation, I think of things like cloud seeding, conservation efforts to things to beef up the supply of Colorado River water specifically that we already have. So we're active in that. And as far as demand in the future, that's more of a service area issue for us. We certainly support any kind of way to support, like the current economic output and the current lifestyle of agricultural areas, like we've been doing with the NDRIP project. We're actively researching ways to keep people in their lifestyle and keep the economy producing as it does on less water. So, you know, we know there's going to be less water. We don't want to, you know, cut people back. We want to be able to have them still be able to do what they did before, but could they maybe do it on less water? So we're looking at things like that. Hope that helps.
Any other questions? Hey, let's give Orestes a hand. We really appreciate it. One point of order, for the benefit of those attending by Zoom and for the benefit of those that will watch it in a training module down the road, could the presenter repeat the questions themselves here by the microphone, and then the audience at large can know what the question was. The next speaker actually is the leader of the AI group that a large subset of us are part of. And he's going to kind of give a general introduction to the future prospects of AI. And he's a faculty at UCR Riverside, Dr. Elia Scudiero.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for organizing this event. I'm happy to be here and talk a little bit about you know, what AI is promising to do for agriculture, providing a general overview about the major applications, but then focusing on the project that we have ongoing between multiple states here in the Southwest, and I'll just use the. We are out of. We are on Zoom. That's why. Yes. Yeah. So we have this project that is funded by USDA to conduct research on applications of artificial intelligence for sustainable agronomy in the western of the U.S. and with a focus on the Colorado River Basin and some areas of California. The project is mostly centered in the UC Riverside, but the University of Arizona, USDA-ARS, and other institutions are playing a big role in it. So today we'll see some of the research that is being conducted across different research areas for the project, and I'm here to maybe provide a overall introduction so you understand somehow the context of why this type of research is being done. So first off, let's say that globally we are facing the challenge of feeding ever-growing population, and the United Nations are projecting the global population to reach 9.7 billion by 2050, which means that we need to improve our agricultural production by 70%. And obviously, there's quite some interest on this challenge from different sectors. And here's an analysis, for example, by Goldman Sachs that has looked at where the gaps in yields are, and in agronomy specifically, how different techniques of improving agriculture globally can help us reach that 2050 target. And you'll see that a lot of the topics that are going to be covered today are somehow featured here, including precision management of fertilizers, of irrigation, better understanding of the systems of monitoring technologies and such. And on top of that, we have, and you've noticed from the change of conversations that come from the magazines that are published for growers and for consultants, that there's an ever-growing presence of technology in the day-to-day farm operations. And this is because we are experiencing these like some call it a democratization of technology, where you can start up new ventures, technological ventures with not as much capital or know-how as it used to be. So it's much easier to come up with new technologies that can perhaps help with improving agriculture. So you see an expansion of robotics and artificial intelligence that is related to all the data and how it's managed. the new hardware, so new sensor, new software, from like smartphone apps to websites and such, and all is tied together with the Internet of Things. So one of the ways that agricultural scientists have been trying to tap into this availability of technology is to try to look if we can use that to understand what problems are local to the specific crops, specific growing practices, specific environments, and try to see if we can come up with highly optimized site and time specific and real-time management that can be that can basically use this new technology. And that comes to like the big promises of AI that we'll talk and see what's feasible, what's not yet proven. So the idea is that can we use artificial intelligence to help reach the USDA long-term sustainability agricultural goals of maintaining the profit revenue from farming from the long term, from the short term to the long term for the future generation, as well as diminish the environmental footprint that agriculture has historically had on the environment, and as well, something that we don't deal too much with in our project, however, enhance the quality of life in rural communities. So I mentioned yield gaps earlier, and there's this beautiful analysis that was published a few years back that looked at major crop production globally, and you can tell that not everywhere crops are being grown optimally. And what this means is that for like the specific breed that you have, for this case is for corn, wheat, and rice, you would have like a grain if you're growing it to the maximum potential yield that is being proven in trials that breed can reach. And when you have red, you are not growing to the full potential. So this analysis showed that globally, by improving irrigation practices and nutrient management practices, we could basically close the yield gaps. And this means different things in different countries, right? So if you think about like rural Africa, where they don't have much history of agriculture or like infrastructure, just improving infrastructure or introducing irrigation, introducing drainage might help. But we can see even in the more advanced nations in terms of agriculture, that we also have yield gaps that we are observing. And here we're going to start talking about the concept of variability. When you go through a landscape and you look at single fields, you will notice that we have like variability of environmental features, elevation, soil properties, and such. And this is an example from Colorado that I like showing, rain-fed wheat crop, and you can see that the yield map up to the left matches basically the raw imagery of the soil, which is in this site very, it tells the story of how deep the soil is and the texture, and so water holding capacity. And obviously you can see how the output at the field scale of the crop is tied to the environment, in this case the soil properties.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is that map represent 100% dry land farming, or is there irrigated agriculture in that map?
No, so this is just one field, and this is just one field. Yeah, there's a scale. It's 300 meters, so it's just one field. But we are scaling up to basically you can do the same type of look at this variability across a state, and this is like a map for California. So that area before, it was very clear the soil was was responsible for most of the variability. But then you look at the entirety of California, and then there's some back-end analysis of remote sensing in the time series. But basically what this tells is that typically you would have areas in a field that are always producing high, areas in a field that are always producing low, but it's very typical to observe big portion of a field that are swinging from year to year. And that's because obviously you have like complex interactions between the crop that you're growing, the practices that you're having, and the environment that you're growing in. And that's the typical relationship that they teach, like that I learned when I went to agricultural school, the yield is this function between the crop that you have, the environment, and the management. However, though, as I hinted from like the previous map, you have a lot of temporal variability across years and within the single year as well as spatial variability. And this is because, you know, environmental factors like soil, water, the weather, pests have a spatial and temporal variability. And as well, the management that you can do to address this also has implicit temporal and spatial variability. So growers basically are well adapted to grow after several years. That, you know, generally you have a good idea on how to best manage your land with based on like previous practices. Maybe you talk to your neighbors as well. You will be working with the same type of crop for a long time. But we have ever changing resource availability, as we spoke, which might make us need to adjust our management. Environment is changing as well with the water availability, soil qualities are changing, weather is changing as well, different pest pressures. So we could either look at you know, a lot of experiments in the different experimental stations around to test new management strategies for like the new needs that are upcoming, or we could you know, try to capture data more sparsely and try to understand this data in a different way, so that with the help of computers to help understand with changing environment, how can we change our management to better address and have like the ultimate goal that for us is to have like this short and long-term economic sustainability, to sustain yields, but at the same time not impact the environment as much as we do. So here's where artificial intelligence can play a role, and that's basically like the technology that refers to the use of computer technologies for automating and optimizing and monitoring agricultural systems. And basically that it can be separated between crop monitoring application, disease detection application, irrigation management, soil analysis. And we'll see some of these examples today from the different talks. Typically, this is used to analyze big amounts of data, not just the single trial done at the Cooperative Extension Experimental Station, but across data sets that are spanning from multiple states typically, and includes use of like fixed sensors, satellites, drones, and such. So you can automate certain tasks, but as well you can just do this current practices and maybe adjust some of what you're doing, irrigation scheduling, or the amount of nitrogen that you're applying in the soil and so on. So typically you would have like advanced field measurements and then models that allow you to take that sensor data to map a property that you are interested in this case like the size of the tree or light interception. And then you have models that relate that measurement to the response of the plant to the environment. And then this is streamlined to like a decision-making process, and we'll see one from today as well, an example of the decision support tools that are provided to the farmer that then ultimately makes a decision and then can implement the decision with either available technologies or newer technology. So in reality, I just like gave like 5 examples of applications, but there's quite a bit, and that's one of the main rationale behind what we're doing. There is so much commercial offering out there for the space of agricultural technologies, AI in agriculture and such, that it can be very confusing as well as very overwhelming, and you don't know if any of these works, if any of these is relevant for the farm, for the local systems that you're working with, because there's a lot out there. Like companies are short of promising you that you know, like just buy our products and then sit back and relax, and then the robots are gonna do your job from now on. And we're not quite there, obviously. And but there are some promises that you know you can hear recurrently if you talk with some people from the industry, such as increased productivity and efficiency, reduced labor and costs, more accurate decision making, improve environmental sustainability. And these promises, like they might be true to some extent for some areas. So with this project, we're focusing on the irrigated land of the Colorado River Basin, as well as some selected areas in California, which are very important because they are employing nowadays 500,000 people and produce quite a bit of revenue for the nation. But we have challenged by prolonged droughts, competition for water use, soil and water degradation, and then new pressure by weed pathogens and insects. So one of the things that might be needed here is a more parsimonious use of natural resources to obtain the same outputs, but by using less resources, and as well a system that allows real-time monitoring. So one of the overarching questions that we had when we decided to work on this was like, can we use satellite data, other network of data and artificial intelligence to perhaps like have a real-time monitoring system that can help with decision support for agronomy in the US Southwest. And with a specific focus on the feasibility of precision management. So the project has overall some cooperative extension objectives, and we are looking at basically vetting technology, mostly with farm trials across Colorado, Arizona, California, as well as organizing these type of events where we present some of the data that we acquire, what is working, what is not working, as well as, and we'll have a talk about these, try to see how these technologies and data can be streamlined in decision support tools, and we have an example that we're going to talk about today as well. Whereas like a lot of the research that is done though on the research side of things is including the look of high resolution satellite data that is available nowadays at very, very high resolution, so 10-yard resolution, and it comes on a daily basis. Can we use that to better characterize agricultural systems with a look at, crop classification, soil mapping, crop water requirement and crop water use, nutrient requirement, and so on, as well as doing some feasibility analysis on if we decide to switch to precision agriculture, where does that work and in what conditions? So some of the work that we are doing includes the use of this PlanetScope data that is private data that from a company that is partnering with the project that provides this type of data down here, which in contrast with publicly available data from NASA has much higher resolution. And the good thing about it is that it comes daily, and it's very, very at high detail. And it can allow us to characterize crops that otherwise were not characterized by remote sensing before. Think about horticultural vegetable crops with a short growth span. If you have an image every 2 weeks, you basically lose half of the growing season, especially if you have like a cloudy day. Whereas with this type of data, that you can properly characterize the growth of those crops. So one of the ways that we use this daily time series is with the computer scientists at Riverside. They are using them to build these curves of the properties observed from space, and using these differences between curves to characterize the different crops. And then can help for regional scale analysis on water use and so on. Another thing that we are doing is to bring in soil moisture sensor data from public and private repositories, and use remote sensing to see if we can, based on a single soil sensor, can we map soil moisture across a site? So instead of having like one point information, can you have it for an entire field? Another thing that we are doing, and I'm like going through these fairly fast because these are like things that we're not going to go see today, but the more interesting thing is going to be presented by the other talker, the other speaker of the day. One of the other things, applications that we're doing with this remote sensing data is to match it with soil maps. And there's a problem here, practical problem, new variety of onion in Imperial Valley they don't know what the salt tolerance is. We map salinity in the background. We use this time series analysis. We match the satellite data with the yield, and then we can estimate how the crop responds to salinity, so salinity gradient over thousands of points rather than doing it old style in the greenhouse with with 5 replicates per treatment. So it's a much more powerful tool to understand how the crop responds to an environment, especially if you're introducing a new crop, a new variety to a region. So another thing that people, especially in Riverside, are doing is to add drone data, smartphone data to the package here and try to see if this can be used to detect weeds and pathogens in vegetable crops. And there's an example here. This is led by McGiffen and Patman and Kayad in Riverside. They are working with transplanted vegetables, and typically those are, especially in organic agriculture, they're plucked by hand by people. Here they fly a drone, they identify how much weeds that you have after a week that you've been transplanting, and allows you to plan for how many people you need to send where and when across the farm. So that's about it. This is like an overall overview of the project. Some of the activities, there's a link here that describes the project overall. Hopefully, what we're going to look at today is that, can we keep can AI keep some of the promises about improving efficiency, understanding how our systems work, and so on. Hopefully, we can repeat these events a little bit in the future when we have a full-fledged utilization of the data that we are going to show today in some tools that leverage AI a little bit better and a little bit to the fuller extent that what we are going to see today. But nonetheless, hopefully, this provided a good overview of what's going on and why we are here today. Thank you.
We have time for questions for Elia, if anyone has any.
What were the types of soil moisture sensing equipment that you used for the data collection?
Repeat the question.
So we are talking about,
question.
we're talking about the soil moisture. The question was, what type of soil sensors were used in this analysis? So I can provide we have time, we can provide a little bit of an overview here. Here we're looking at 3 different networks. The SCAN and the USCRN are public weather station networks that have time domain reflectometers at several depths. Here we're looking at the surface soil moisture. And the other gray points are from a private company that provides decision support for irrigation, mostly in agronomic crops, where you can see that they have thousands and thousands of measurements across California. And they work with capacitance sensors. So it's single location sensors that have multiple depths measurements. And the idea here is that, you have your measurement, but generally you have funds to put at the farm level 1 per block, let's say 1 sensor every 40 acres. And we know that most of times that's not enough to fully characterize what the soil moisture is across the area. So can we use satellite data to understand, okay, based on that measure that you have in that one point, can we also tell it in the rest of the farm? And you cannot do it based on that one sensor. You need to leverage the entirety of the data set across the different soil types, the different weather types, the different crop types across the entire nation, basically, to be able to estimate from one sensor at the other end of the field what the thing is looking like. So it looks okay from our preliminary results, but there's much more to be done in that sense as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, let's give Elia a hand. Elia will be our last speaker as well today after I introduce another beneficial use of water and salinity management. Elia will kind of touch on some potential AI applications in that kind of management. The next speaker, I didn't know this speaker 9 years ago, but the 7 irrigation entities, administrative entities in Yuma came to me and said, we want this project. We want to look at updated crop coefficients. We want to quantitate all beneficial uses. And we want you to do this real fast. Well, I didn't have all the skill sets to do this. I asked around, and everyone says, well, you need to talk to Dr. Andy French. Well, I didn't know Dr. Andy French. So I showed up in his office one day, hat in hand, and I said, Andy, this is what I've been asked to do. Can you help? And we've been sewed at the hip ever since then. And I'd like to introduce Andy French, and he's going to talk about ET and measuring ET.
Well, good morning. So I'm Andy French, and as Dr. Sanchez says, we've been kind of stitched at the hip for the last 6 years. And I want to talk about evapotranspiration and use of satellite data to measure that in addition to current technologies with instrumentation called Eddy Covariance. And so the question is, what does this have to do with AI, right? Because that's what this workshop's about. Well, what it has to do with is that we need to know how much water is actually being used in farms as grown right now. The crops that have been monitored and reported are based, the water used is based on 50-year-old data. The old Yuma Mesa farm, Leonard Erie and company did some really excellent gravimetric soil moisture studies, and they've been a foundation, at least for Arizona, for the crop water use statistics. They've surveyed many, many crops. They didn't cover all of them, but as growers know, the way farms are managed today are not the same as they were in 1962. Obviously, the varieties of crops grown are different. And so there's a real need to just update how much water is being used by the most significant crops. But the part of this project was funded not just to update the crop coefficients, and I mean, not just to update the crop water use, but was to update the crop coefficients, which, by the way, is probably not widely used by growers, but we think could be. And the reason it's important to update those coefficients is that the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation uses them. So whether growers use them or not is one question, but the Bureau of Reclamation and their accounting for the lower Colorado River water resources is based on those crop coefficients. And some of you probably know this, but the reason that whole accounting system that Reclamation has is something that dates back to the early 60s when Arizona and California couldn't agree on water allocations. And the U.S. Supreme Court mandated an annual accounting system. That old accounting system was based on a relatively crude methodology of residual accounting, of looking at water budget. Around 2003, that methodology changed and incorporated crop coefficients and some satellite data, mainly land cover classification. So what I'd like to do today is present two parts. The first part is to look at ground instrumentation called Eddy Covariance stations, most of which you're probably familiar with, and how we measure crop water use in important crops. And then the second part is how do we use those data along with satellite technology to estimate how much water is being used on a daily basis across many fields. So, Eddy Covariance, it's what we consider to be the gold standard for measuring how much water is used by crops to measure ET. But it isn't the only way, as I'll explain in a minute. It's a very good but technically challenging way to map crop water use. Mouthful, sorry, not enough coffee. It is not for the lighthearted to adopt this technology, but it is a very good and well-proven technology. The four figures on your left show you some deployments primarily over lettuce, and then there's some plastic mulch there in the lower left. I believe those are melons. We've deployed those things throughout the Yuma Valley and to some extent up here near Maricopa. And we set them out there to measure crop water use from the beginning where they plant the crop till the end where they begin the harvest. What it can do is measure not just water use, but carbon flux, and give you a good idea of your soil moisture status. There's an excellent resource, freely available over the web through Lycor company, George Burba 2022. If you want to know the details about Eddy Covariance, this is an excellent resource for you to look at. The background to other methods for getting measurements, not talking about the remote sensing yet, but just the measurements of crop water use. Well, first there's lysimetry, which is a long-standing methodology that's also excellent approach. It is a difficult to implement approach because it requires some infrastructure in farm fields, and you have to manage the field so that the crop grows in conditions in the lysimeter the same as it would if it were not an lysimeter. Probably the most famous lysimeters are the large monolithic weighing lysimeters in Bushland, Texas. Many studies have come out of that and quantified how much water, but it's not a very practical technique for looking at a wide variety of geographic locations and different kinds of crops. Surface renewal method, I mentioned that, is maybe not as well known. It's being widely promoted in California. I'm aware of, there's a company that's producing it. I have some expertise in surface renewal, and I think it's an interesting technique that offers a possibility of measuring crop water use at lower instrumentation cost. But it has a drawback in that it doesn't actually measure the water use. It measures all the other components, and then you determine what water use is by residual. Soil moisture profiling. Well, I'm standing right in front of one of the guys that's a major expert in soil moisture profiling with neutron probes. It's an excellent technique, quite labor intensive, solid science that you can do. It also requires some regulatory approval using radioactive sources. Excellent scientific tool, but not as difficult as lysimetry, but not as flexible as Eddy Covariance. Scintillometry is a method that we've explored and continue to explore in the Yuma Valley. It's been looked at in other parts of the Midwest. And its advantage is that you can measure large extents of agricultural land using 2 stations on towers. So it has the potential for being useful for large extents of crop water use. Its drawback is similar to the surface renewal method in that it relies on residual analysis. I mentioned sap flow here. Well, sap flow is no good for vegetable crops, but certainly useful for trees. So if you had almonds or citrus, it'd be an excellent way for measuring transpiration. However, if you're interested in doing the whole water budget, for example, you need to know evaporation. It doesn't give you that information. So I present some of these options for measuring crop water use in the context of using Eddy Covariance. And I guess I did mention gravimetric, but I want to reiterate, if you want to do the old school way, go out the samples, you can collect those soil samples the way Leonard Erie and Company did in 1962. Excellent way to measure crop water use, very labor intensive, inflexible. So what I'm proposing to do today is that the Eddy Covariance method with some suitable technical expertise is a great way to get current water use. Here's the components of an Eddy Covariance system. This is a Campbell Scientific system. There's another system from Lycor. Those are the 2 main systems that you'll see deployed. Complicated, requires about $50,000 worth of equipment, mainly 2 tripods that are located out in the field. What you see circled here are the main components. And the red circles are the core of your measurements. The sonic anemometer, which is an acoustic device that measures wind speed, air temperature, and there's an infrared gas analyzer that measures water vapor flux and CO2 flux. There's also a conventional air temperature and humidity sensor on the right-hand circle. In the background, in green, is your power supply. So you need about 80 watts of power to run the Eddy covariance station, the supply the infrared gas analyzer, and run the data logger. This is a lettuce deployment in 2017. In Yuma, we've deployed over 70 sites. In fact, I think we've deployed over 90 sites to date. And we've looked at many, many fields. This wouldn't be possible with other techniques. What do data look like when after you've collected and logged it back in? It looks something like this. A lot of jittery daily water use evapotranspiration data as illustrated here in the black curve. This is for wheat. Data are collected at 20 hertz and then subsampled to 30 minutes and then subsampled further into a daily time series. So we aggregate at a hierarchical method. On the left-hand side there is the beginning of the planting season. So in this case, durum wheat was planted in late December and was harvested in May. You can see the black curve climbs. The daily ET, which is in millimeters per day, goes up to around 10 millimeters per day. The red curve is your reference curve, potential evapotranspiration, which is provided by the Arizona Weather Network, also in California by the CIMMYS Weather Network. There's another topic of discussion that I won't go into great detail here, but what we mean by potential evapotranspiration can mean different things. It depends on what your reference crop is. It's a theoretical reference that could be alfalfa or could be short clipped grass predominantly. On this graph also shows you where the irrigation events occur on the bottom and the rainfall, which for Yuma is normally small. So this is what you would be presented with on a daily time scale from Eddy covariance. I wanted to show some examples from some real crops, real data that we've done with Eddy covariance over the years. So here's iceberg and romaine studies. We've done 12 of them. It's probably the most rigorous study that we've done of crop water use of any of the crops we've studied thus far. On the upper left, you can see a site where we have daily evapotranspiration in a spiky manner there, which shows that the irrigation occurs and it drops rapidly in a soil drying episode, then spikes again, and then this repeated irrigation cycles are very clearly resolved with Eddy covariance. And then the red curve, as in the previous slide, is your reference evapotranspiration. There's another example on the lower left, a different crop, and also you can see the spikiness, which is not a random feature. This is representing influx of irrigation events. And you can see here we're getting around 12 inches required for lettuce. Here's sort of a summary of some 4 crops we've looked at Yuma, showing the variability throughout the growing season for wheat, cotton, broccoli, and alfalfa. And shows the difference between potential evapotranspiration and actual evapotranspiration, and the range of variability between different experimental sites, because everyone is a little different depending on soil type, irrigation practices, and the weather. Note that crops such as broccoli are planted at winter solstice, so that it's a general, that's the lower left hand. You can see how the pattern is kind of, that shaded blue shows you the typical daily ET that you get from that crop is quite flat. That's because the solar radiation is minimum. Whereas in the lower right-hand side, you can see alfalfa, where it peaks in the middle of summer, and you can see tremendous variability across different alfalfa crops and sites. And that variability, of course, is not just due to solar radiation, it's because of different cutting practices of the different fields. Cotton is interesting, is it's a very consistent and tightly low range evapotranspiration throughout the year. And wheat is sort of a little bit in between cotton and the variability of broccoli. Shows you that during the middle of the season there's very predictable daily water use. But there's variability in the beginning, so when the crop is planted in late December, early January, and then in the final part of the season when the crop is senesced. We can measure that with Eddy covariance, and these are the results that you get. Here are some numbers, and we monitor the soil type, so we know how to correlate between the water used, the yield of the crop, the total water used, and the soil types. We've looked at these crops here, broccoli, cauliflower, lettuce, wheat. These are just some examples I wanted to show you. We not only look at what the Eddy covariance technique produces, but we compare that with the historical tabulated data from Leonard Erie, which I'd mentioned previously. And we also look at the irrigation amounts applied. It's a little tricky to accurately measure irrigation inputs depending on the irrigation system, but we do our best to measure the inflow of those water flumes. So you're not supposed to focus on negative things, but I will. So Eddy covariance is a great technique, but we don't buy an Eddy covariance and just plop it out in the middle of the field, turn the switch on and run Campbell Scientific easy flux, log the data, put it on a spreadsheet, and off you go. Don't do that. You really need some expertise, either in-house or you need to find somebody else that can provide you that. Here's why. There's three reasons that you can get into trouble with Eddy covariance. Then there's many others, right? Rodents. I'm not even mentioning rodents and birds that can destroy your equipment. Flux footprint. So when you put one of these stations out to measure water use, you don't put it in a teeny tiny field that's just a few acres, because the problem is that this is integrating the water used by plants over what we call a flux footprint. And that flux footprint depends on the surface roughness. So if you have a short crop, a relatively smooth surface, aerodynamically smooth, or it could be fruit trees, which is very aerodynamically rough. It depends on the wind direction. So if you put this Eddy covariance station on the edge of your field, half of the time the wind's going to be blowing from behind you, blowing over a parking lot or something. That's can tell you anything, so you have to remove that. So I'm showing you on the left are some contour plots from some lettuce fields that we did, the 12 lettuce fields that I mentioned to you, and we've measured with this analysis. And the website is not unique, but this is one of them, footprint.clune.net. It provides an online tool for computing your footprint of your Eddy covariance. And what we've done is we've looked at all the fields and we've evaluated whether the data were collected at that field was always within the field, or whether we were contaminated by signature from outside the field. And what we found is that most of the time we were in good shape. We had lots of data from within the field, but a few instances, if you look at these graphs, you'll find that the data comes from off field. So what do? You have to go back in there and look at the raw data and remove that and then fill those gaps. On the right-hand side shows you sort of a profile view, what I call the flux footprint. It's the weighting. So the y-axis is the weighting of the signal that you're getting from the water vapor flux, and the x-axis is the distance away from your Eddy covariance. So you put your Eddy covariance station in the middle of the field. You're not actually measuring water flux right where the station is. That's sort of like it's a Fisherian probability distribution function there. It rises and peaks maybe 10, 20, 30 meters away from your station. And then exponentially drops as it gets further away. And what I'm demonstrating in these 4 plots is when you change the parameters, which we won't go into in this talk, but shows you when you change surface roughness, wind speed, measurement height. If you measure your fluxes from a high position above your crop, your flux footprint is going to be much further out. And so it can go outside the bounds of the field. If you're down too low, you can be violating the principles of your eddy covariance aerodynamics. Energy flux closure. So here's another pitfall for eddy covariance. Like, no system's perfect. We're assuming 4 main flux components that get you water use. Net radiation, so it's essentially your solar radiation and your thermal radiation, which is your radiance from your heat from your soil and heat from the atmosphere. What we call G, the soil heat flux, that's the energy that goes into the ground. And then you have 2 turbulent flux components, which we call H and LE. H is your sensible heat flux. That's the heat transported based on temperature, air temperature, transport up and down. And then LE is essentially your swamp cooler term, right? It's latent heat. That's what you want. That, in order to get water use, you want that LE term. There's 2 other terms we often ignore, but maybe we shouldn't. It's called delta Q. That's the storage in the canopy. Not important for broccoli and lettuce and other short crops. But if you're dealing with trees, thick trees or thick maybe sorghum or something, there's a lot of energy that's stored dynamically within the canopy, and you need to account for that. And then F is your photosynthetic consumption of energy, usually less than 1%, very small term. But that equation, which I listed there at the top, should balance to 0, and it never does. And the question is, how badly does it not balance? If you run your analyses on your eddy covariance and you're getting less than 80% closure, you're in trouble. Because that's, 20% of the net radiation that you've measured is unaccounted for by your micrometeorological instrumentation. So it's important that you do careful data deployment and field processing with good programming routines to reduce that closure error as much as possible. But you'll never, even with the great processing, remove all that closure error. So if you're going to report these results, how do you do it? Well, no peer-reviewed journal is going to accept your data without saying, how did you close the data? So the 3 techniques here is you can stuff all the energy into your latent heat flux, or maybe your sensible heat flux. If your crop is dominated, if the water use is dominated by vegetation, then you might stuff all your residuals into that. You can do a weighting by what's called Bowen ratio. That's the sensible heat to latent heat ratio. And you can do this at time steps, either at the logger, which is usually aggregated at 30 minutes, or you can do it at the daily time step. On the left-hand side, I show you a graph of a residual analysis for a lettuce field we did, and we have a very high closure there of about 91%, which means we're missing about 9% that we have to stuff back into the equation. A third pitfall. So I'm saying it's a great technique and telling you all the problems with it, but gap filling. So no instrument is going to give you a complete error-free data because, as I say, rodents are going to go chewing your cables. The birds are going to poop on your radiometers. The logger is going to go out. You know, the solar panels didn't get charged. There's always something that goes wrong out in the field. That's real world. And how do you handle that? Well, there are now gap filling tools. Commercial software provides you the data gap filling tools. There's an online resource that I've listed here in the bottom out of Jena, Germany. that's an excellent tool that allows you to upload basic weather data. So you combine what you know about your data and the weather data, which we would use from, say, ASMET or CIMIS. And we upload it into the web tool, and it comes back with a gap-filled tool. It's the best estimate for filling the gaps. If you want total water use for your crop, you need to know a gap-free analysis, and that's what we've done here. So we're now comparing, we're looking at the transition here of comparing eddy covariance data with modeled and going into remote sensing. We've taken those 4 crops that are presented before, broccoli, cotton, wheat, and alfalfa, and we're comparing those eddy covariance versus different models. And there's a lot of data here, but what I want to show you, impression I want to give you is that those models are exactly that. They're not real world, they're our best estimates, and they fail sometimes, particularly in early season when the crop is sparse and you get a lot of open soil evaporation. And they also fail when they don't account for the length of the season. In the upper right, cotton, for example, the models keep telling you that there's water used when in fact conventional practice shows that the crop is ended. We've looked at quite a few model estimates of ET versus what the eddy covariance. And you're probably well aware, it's been marketed pretty heavily, this Open ET product. And I've been a contributor and will continue to be a contributor to Open ET. That is a project that's a consortium of several groups putting together 6 different ET models and an ensemble, which is an average of those models for all the western U.S. states. And if you go on that website, you can draw a polygon around your field of interest and extract a daily water use. And you can get it. You get an estimate for daily water use for all 6 models, and you can compare that with what you think is known. This is what we've done here. You show that there's lots of differences and there's some fair amount of agreement. Eddy covariance processing software, I'll end really the eddy covariance component of this. So if you're going to use eddy covariance, you need some expertise. You need some technical skills. There's 12 of them, 12 options for processing software. I'm familiar with one of them. Well, 2 of them, I guess. I don't know all these, but you should be aware, if you're going to have anybody do any eddy covariance work, that there are options out there. Many of these are totally free to download. When they're not free is your time to learn how to drive the software. But the main point is this: don't roll your own processing software, right? Yeah, you can read it up and you can say, oh, I know how to process. Well, it's a very complicated process. These software packages will save you a lot of grief, and I suggest you take a look at them. Remote sensing to estimate ET, and this feeds a little bit into the AI themes. So we cannot afford to do eddy covariance on all our fields continuously. We need some other tools and techniques to simplify that. We use eddy covariance to tell us what the truth is, but we need to extend that, as Elia has described. The amount of remote sensing sensors out there now has exploded. And not only has the number of sensors exploded, but the tools available to analyze that data stream have begun to explode, which means that you don't have to do all that. Landsat, Sentinel-2, and Planet are 3 of the sensors that are notable here. The model estimates, like from OpenET, you can get that on the web. You can get vegetation index-based models, and you can get crop coefficient models, where we have focused our work. So the inputs for those satellite data are typically vegetation indices and the visible near infrared. land surface temperature, which gives you an idea of a direct measure of ET. And then lastly, on the right-hand side is a crop classification map, which allows you to accurately partition your satellite data into the proper crop coefficient domain. So I'll focus on crop coefficients. So why do we use crop coefficients? It's a very simplified method. It is not a precise model, but it's an easy to implement model that's been calibrated over the years. It's been published in FAO 56 documentation. The scheme is this. It's a trapezoidal pattern as shown on the left-hand side. You see that it has initial phase, a development phase, a mid stage, and an end stage. Very simplified method. You generate a curve, or more like a trapezoid. You generate those trapezoids for your crop and multiply it, very easy, multiply it by potential ET. And you can get daily ET, a good estimate of ET. And on the bottom, you can see the difference between potential ET and that model ET, which is the blue curve. On the right-hand side shows you how to get those crop coefficient curves from satellite remote sensing data. These are examples from the same 4 crops: wheat, broccoli, cotton, and alfalfa. The data quality from satellite data is so good, and it doesn't hurt that Arizona has a lot of clear skies. Might have trouble maybe in Iowa, but California and Arizona were fortunate to have lots of clear skies, and you can get tremendously crisp daily estimates of vegetation index over the season, and that can translate into accurate crop coefficients. Here's some more examples show you how we translate those crop coefficients using specified crop coefficients from FAO 56 and also from Marv Jensen's work from the late 1990s and early 2000s, and now used by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. The green curves show you those crop coefficients. The red is your potential ET, and the green is your crop coefficient, and the blue is the satellite remote sensing data. To summarize some of this, what can we do with remote sensing that we couldn't do with just ground observations? Well, the scope is to completely blown off the map what you used to be able to do before, or you might study a dozen fields over a few years. Now you can do hundreds to thousands of fields with remote sensing. What kinds of results do we get? On the left-hand side, alfalfa duration. So early work from the Water Conservation Lab, Doug knows this study quite well with lysimetry. We knew that the duration of cuttings varied, the duration based on the cutting number, and we knew something about the water consumption of alfalfa during the season. But what allows us to do now with remote sensing, we can track that very accurately for all alfalfa fields, and that's what's demonstrated. On the bottom left is showing you the alpha cuttings. U.S. Bureau of Reclamation standardizes their estimates of water accounting. Should we be annoyed that they standardize it? I don't know, but this is what they use for their accounting. Well, they use a static thing. Well, every farmer's different, right? Your cutting practices are all different. With satellite data, you can measure exactly how many cuttings there are per year, and that's what that graph is intended to illustrate. On the upper right-hand side shows you some differences between what Bureau of Reclamation and FAO 56 uses for crop coefficients versus what we see from satellite data. Sometimes those estimates are pretty good, and sometimes they're really wrong. Like, for example, Reclamation thinks that all wheat in Yuma is planted in early to mid-December. Well, it isn't. It's actually planted later, and it's harvested a little bit earlier than what they think. So the satellite data is going to help inform them to make their models better. And the bottom right just shows you that when you use standardized estimates of crop water use, you get the red curve, and when you use actual remote sensing data, you appreciate the variability amongst different fields. Accessing remote sensing data, it's it's the long list, kind of like the Eddy Covariance. There are many, many tools, but here I'll put it into really two main categories. You can do what's called cloud processing, which means that the satellite data files are huge. I started in this field when I had to download a single Landsat image over a phone modem, dee, 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 the old phone modems, really slow and terrible, and then you would process it line by line. Now you can do all that processing online. You don't download any of the data. That's what's called cloud processing. In the upper left is a snippet from Google Earth Engine. So a little bit of JavaScript that you can steal from other people's codes. You can put your JavaScript in. You can put in the coordinates for your field. You put the time scale in, type it in. 10 seconds to 30 seconds later, you'll have hundreds of fields. You'll get the vegetation index back very quickly. On the lower left is a similar tool out of the European Space Agency, Sentinel Hub. On the right-hand side are the two choices that I would look at if you really want your own data to look at on your own desktop computer. One is the Copernicus Open Access site, which is out of the European Space Agency, and the lower right is the USGS Earth Explorer. Both tools allow you to access the actual surface reflectance data. Lastly, this was brought to me by my colleague, Ella Wisniewski. The hybrid processing is our tool. It does both cloud processing, local processing in one package. I haven't even used it yet, but it's very impressive. Just to point out to you that the tools are coming out very frequently. Some ancillary points to make about water use. Drones are everywhere, right? But I mean, how good are they? I mean, what are we going to do with these things? I mean, is it a practical farm tool? Well, they're certainly practical if you need to know fractional cover relationships to calibrate your remote sensing processing. And here's some examples over some lettuce we did in Yuma several years ago. We used these drone images to calibrate our vegetation index to fractional cover. We can do that and then run other models using space data, which would be at much coarser resolution. Well, what's the bottom line of all this? This graph illustrates what I think one of the bottom lines is. Like, use of remote sensing and backed up by Eddy covariance changes the story of how much water is being used by crops. And the green is what reclamation has used under what they call LCRAS. On the yellow is the Leonard Erie data from 1960s, 70s. I mean, both really solid science that went into those methods. But the water use from those data sets is really different from what we're getting, which is the orange, which shows you that we need to use modern tools to get water use as grown by farmers today. We cannot use these static, older techniques. We need to constantly update. So I hope I haven't talked too long, but this is what the story I'd like to leave you with. And one is that Eddy covariance is a technique that allows you to measure water use very accurately. It's a very effective technique, but you need expertise to use it. Remote sensing is more than an emerging technology. It's part of the portfolio for keeping track of water use. A very simple way to do that is to use vegetation indices to allow you to get fractional cover. It allows you to look at agricultural lands anywhere around the globe at a daily time step. Using both Eddy covariance data along with remote sensing are robust tools that allow you to get accurate water use for any crop of interest, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you.
We got behind, but we'll take time for a couple of questions because Andy gave a lot of good information there, and I'll go ahead and. Is there any questions for Dr. French? I guess you answered everything.
I talked too long, sorry.